So we'll start the webinar in a few minutes while other people join. Meanwhile, it would be fun if you tell us where you're joining us from, which part of the country. You can just put your answers in the chat. We have someone from Chennai. We have someone from New Delhi. Ankur is joining us from Dubai, right, Ankur?
That's right.
And Tanvi and I are both joining you from Delhi. We have someone from Pune. So the format of the webinar is really interactive. We'd really love for you to ask us lots of questions as we go along, and Ankur is here to answer them for you. Please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat. It's easier for us to answer questions when they're in the Q&A box. The host of this evening today will be Tanvi, and I'll be joining in to help her with your queries and manage some of those. I think we're almost at mark. Tanvi, do you want to start by introducing Ankur?
Great. Thank you, Seema. Welcome everyone to the webinar on mindset shifts from employees to manager to a leader with Ankur Tulsian. A brief introduction about Ankur. Ankur is currently based in Dubai and has over 10 years of experience in general management and strategy roles in B2C and B2B2C businesses, especially in early and growth stage companies. Previously, Ankur has worked as a senior engagement manager at McKinsey & Company. And at the moment, he's working as the general manager for Super App Tenant program at Careem. So in today's session, we will be keeping this as an interactive webinar. So please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A channel today. The idea for today's webinar is for all professionals across different levels who are looking to enhance their leadership skills and take their careers to the next level. We are here to learn from Ankur's professional journey on how he developed his career and shifted his mindset and pushed himself out of his comfort zone to grow to a general manager level over these 10 years. So welcome, Ankur, for joining, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for the introduction, and very excited to be here, and happy to share any learnings and experiences with the audience.
I think before we begin, we just wanted to talk a little about the AMP program, which is an accelerated management program where it's a 6-month management program really for people with few years of experience who are now at a point where they are looking to do something different with their life or just enhance their skills and also get some amount of understanding on how to grow themselves from just being an employee to maybe a manager, or if they're a manager, how to sort of move into leadership positions. So Ankur, I think I'll fire the first question and ask you, really, what's the difference between an employee, a manager, and a leader? I mean, isn't everybody just an employee at the end of the day?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think everyone is an employee, but I think the way I see this is like, I mean, of course, as you're joining into any profession, you're sort of the junior employee. Largely, the term that's also sometimes used is an individual contributor, which is basically saying that you're responsible for doing something and sort of delivering results, but you're not managing a team, so to speak, right? Whether directly or indirectly. So you're sort of necessarily responsible to do your task yourself. And then you're generally reporting to someone who becomes then a manager, and then the manager then reports to someone a bit more senior, and so on and so forth, right? So, and I think the difference from a manager perspective is that they're not just doing the job; they're responsible to get some jobs done for the organization through a team, typically of people. Now, sometimes directly reporting, sometimes you might have indirect reports and people who you have to influence to get the job done and so on. Actually, a lot of tech roles have a very heavy influence culture as opposed to a direct authority culture. And that's sort of also there with a lot of project roles across organizations. And then I think, Seema, the leader is more an attitude, I think, than a label or something. It's more that when you're sort of taking really the long view in any sort of context, taking, okay, like in a quarter, year, how do I solve a problem with that perspective? And then sort of break it into parts and delegate it down to managers who then sort of get it done through their team. So that's how I see that. It's like, as you grow a career, your context shifts, your priorities shift, your scope becomes more complex in some shape or form. And I think, that's where the focus, I feel like that's where a lot of the leadership mindset shifts need to happen as you progress along these stages.
Tanvi?
Okay, thank you. So, Ankur, I would love to learn more about, when you started in your first career at Henkel. How did you, what were some of the key career goals you had defined for yourself, when you were starting out as an entry level, candidate in your first job? And would love to learn how you were defining your career to where you are today.
Yeah, sure. So I think I joined Henkel as pretty much a generalist into a strategy office role early on. And, that gives me a lot of a bird's eye view of how a business is run. So learned a lot about like those aspects of a business. But very soon I realized that, it's to actually progress in the career, you need to sort of actually have the experience of doing something yourself, and not just sort of not just looking at it from the sidelines, but actually have ownership of a particular topic that you've delivered on. That gives you that confidence to propel to the next level. So so that's the way it helped me. So I quickly moved into a category role within Henkel, where I had line responsibilities to sort of deliver profitability of a product portfolio, do things like decisions on whether the product needs to be optimized. So that has stayed as a constant goal for me. So even after consulting, when I moved to Careem, like I was sort of very quick to move out of a strategy role within the organization to sort of a more commercial P&L role, where then I could sort of put these things to test, keep learning and growing. So that has always been the objective for me, is like, make sure you invest in the skills. The first decade of my life has to be about sharpening those, and then sort of the next decades can be about sort of then making sure that I'm delivering based on the skills that I have developed.
So, Ankur, when people start thinking about, these days, I probably come from a generation much before yours, you would look to move into a leadership role when you had a few decades of experience under your belt. But these days you have people with just 1 decade of work experience, sometimes even lesser, where they have to manage a leadership sort of role, or they get into that, or they get an opportunity to be a leader. So I wanted to understand from you, are there any sort of basic skills that one must develop early in your career that can eventually sort of help you to move into these roles, which then sort of, demand so much from you? Because it's interesting to call yourself a leader, but it's a very, very demanding challenge in the corporate world, right?
No, 100%. And I think I think it depends a bit on the kind of role you're in. So if you're in a very technically or a complex role, or a functionally specific role, so for example, if you think about marketing, if you think about product engineering, or if you think about let's say even finance, like those are skills where a lot of the leadership comes from actually also knowing the functional core skills that you need to know. So how does marketing actually work, etc. So you build on those. But I think as a generalist, the skills that you develop are a lot more around the problem solving, around the communication, around the ability to sort of think strategically, and then sort of break down a problem into smaller parts and so on. And I think within that realm of things, like I think the what helps you sort of grow a lot more faster sometimes is the ability to sort of zoom in and zoom out very quickly. And I think this is sort of one thing that that the sooner you learn as a manager, the faster you are sort of progressing. And what I mean here is, and I like to take example of like let's think about a restaurant chef, right, where you are sort of Like if you're a junior employee, you're probably like let's say a junior chef managing an egg station, making omelets for customers, right? Very specific, you're doing what you need to do and so on. As you become a manager, what you're now starting to do is to say, okay, you know what, like I need to make sure that the breakfast buffet is actually getting served and the customers are generally happy. So I need to make sure that every station actually is delivering to whatever they wanted to do. But at the same time, let's say if I find a problem with the egg station, I'm able to sort of go and help the chef there and sort of maybe manage the load because it's a peak time for them, right? So that zooming into that egg station and then zooming out to make sure that I'm covering the breadth, that's the skill that becomes quite relevant, I think. And so once you start doing that enough, and then sort of the if you add to that piece the block of saying, now how do I zoom out, take that perspective, synthesize it, and then communicate with your leaderships, with your customers in succinct messages, make sure that they are aligned with whatever is happening, and vice versa, that you're able to take their guidance and translate down. I think that's what allows you to then very quickly sort of rise up in the hierarchy, if you will. I think in my experience, once senior people in the organization start to be able to speak to you in a language that they feel comfortable with, and know that they are confident that, you know, you can get it done once you've been given a bit of a guidance, that's when people start looking at you as a leader. I think that's what the difference is in my mind.
Thank you, Ankur. I have a question. So, you know, how does one, you know, in their career really think about what's the right time to take up more leadership responsibilities, given the nature of workplaces are changing constantly? And, you know, I think in startups, there are a lot of independent contributor roles as well. You know, what are some of the questions one should think about or reflect on, you know, when thinking about taking up responsibilities of other team members?
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of times you have, till you don't know. But I think it's like this, right? Like when you're in your mind made that transition to becoming a manager, you know when you've achieved that. And I think there are some of these transitions that you go through early on in your career, right? So the first one of those is potentially to say, okay, like how do I actually be effective in delegating, right? How can I actually work with someone and get stuff done from them with sort of the right approach to them, at the same time champion them enough so that they have the help and the guidance and the mentorship to sort of deliver on what you need to do. When you feel comfortable not knowing all the details, but, you know, at the same time saying, okay, look, I understand what's happening here and I don't need to get into the details because I trust someone else to do it. So there is that switch that happens for people. And I think my advice is, like, because I have actually had this problem myself where I was trying to push for a managerial position too early without sort of going through that motions of that shift. My advice generally is like not to rush it, because in the largest career span of like 25 years of a professional stand, like you don't, like a year here or there doesn't matter. Like you should move when you're ready, and you should sort of do some small experiments before you sort of take the big leap, like manage one project, manage sort of a smaller scope, like extend yourself a little bit. And once you're able to see that, you know, you're able to actually do it, take feedback from the leaders in the organization, from the employees who you're managing, you start to get a sense on whether you're ready to take the next level, and then you move on. Because it's always sounds glamorous to sort of become a manager, become a leader, but if you're not prepared for it, it actually can be the worst of both the worlds, becoming a manager and you're not ready for it.
I'm going to quickly take one question, Tanvi, before you ask your question. This is Manoj. He wants to know, does the current time and inflation allow one to take some time off to sharpen skills? Is this, like, I think what he's trying to ask is this really a good time to think about sharpening skills or doing something that can sort of, you know, eventually change your trajectory?
So I think if you asked me this question 5 years ago, Seema, I would have said, no, you shouldn't take breaks in your career. You shouldn't sort of invest in this way by sort of compromising on other things. I need to run on that treadmill. Like, I think after like being in the 30s and having worked for 10 years, like you realize that actually, you know, you're in this for a marathon and not a sprint. And so actually, you know, that marathon means that I need to be able to sustain myself, right? And sort of make sure that I'm also running the same speed when I'm at my 40s. And that requires upskilling. And so I think investing into upskilling obviously is never a bad idea. Obviously, like, everyone has a different context. Like there are times when you cannot do it, etc. But if you have the ability to do it, I've taken a sabbatical myself from work where I sort of 3 months, I took a step back and actually did not work. And then this is where I learned everything I could about what was happening in the market, industry trends, etc. Figured out what I wanted to do next, and then moved into that transition. So I've done that actually twice in my career, and both of the times I've never regretted it. And no one else has ever asked me why or why not. And I've known people who've taken actually longer sabbaticals, and it really works. So I would say that if you don't have a personal reason not to do it, if you're not under a pressure or time pressure, don't self-impose that pressure of not doing this.
Very quickly, I think this is one question that many people sort of often have and think about is, and I think maybe they read it somewhere or that's what they believe. They think leaders are born. You don't really make leaders. Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, again, I can only tell about myself personally. I actually think, I don't think I was ever born a leader. Like I was a pretty mediocre student in my IIT days, like, a decent average person who had dabbled a bit with leadership positions here or there. It's only when I actually started working that I actually started to sharpen some of the toolkits, some of the mindsets that I needed to sort of pick up. I don't think I was born a leader in any shape or form. I do think that I actually cultivated it. And personally, I have this heuristic. I think that, anyone has that 5 year to make a career transition happen, right? Like you're 2 jobs away from the best case job that you want for yourself. So like you should always think about your third job from here, and then make sure that you're doing the first and the second one. So the next one after that to be, and in that 5 year period, which is again an approximation 2-3 years in 2 jobs, where you can actually transition into a leadership position or any other skill set actually that I think is possible.
Tanvi, you are at a managerial role right now. If you wanted to move into a leadership role, what are the 2 things that you would ask Ankur?
Yes. So thanks for asking that, Seema. I'm actually in an independent contributor role, Ankur. And, in the past, I think I have not been a great manager. I feel, I think there are added responsibilities for a manager, right? And I know there is a very interesting question, which I think I would like to build on that. What has been your experience in failure in management, in any of your past roles, when you were leading a team? And what are some of the things that a manager, first time manager should do in the first month or the second month or the third month of their role of taking, responsibilities of more team members?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to ask this because like when I was actually transitioning, so within consulting, when I was actually starting to become an engagement manager, the first few projects I had a very theoretical approach to saying, okay, look, here's what I'm going to do in my first month. Here are the 5 things that I will get done. I had a checklist of like, I need to do these things and so on and so forth. As soon as like week 1, you're in it, like everything just went out of the window. And I was just like knee deep sunk into just trying to survive. And literally it was that, right? Like it was baptism by fire sort of for me. And I think the reason why I kind of went through that transition is like, you can learn everything about this in textbooks and you can speak to whoever, but unless you do it yourself, you don't know it. The reason why I was failing a lot is I was doing 2 jobs. So I was trying to be the manager as well as trying to deliver the things as I would have done myself. So now I was responsible for the entire project and I was still trying to be as close as to the ground as possible, working very closely with my team, making sure the output was exactly how I wanted them to be, and then sort of taking a step back, collating everything and communicating. I was having sleepless nights. I was spending a lot of hours doing that. And I actually thought that I should do that because as a manager, you hear all the time, the buck stops with you. You are responsible for the delivery, the quality, and so on and so forth. I think this realization that I couldn't do 2 jobs and the new job that I needed to do well has to mean that I have to let go of things at the detail level. And I think that transition was sort of the biggest one that I learned. So Tanvi, I think that's what I would suggest is like, being practical about what level of detail you can get into and you need to get into in a certain conversation is an acquired skill, and it requires practice. Like you have to start calibrating almost with different teams and different contexts to say, okay, look, this is a team member, or this is an area that I actually trust well enough for them to deliver a quality of the output which is good enough for me that I can just take. And then the other areas where, I know that I'll have to spend a little bit more time coaching, working with that person. And so I start to optimize for that. The other thing that I started to do very differently is like let go, like whenever I was sort of looking at something, let go of the vision I have of how an outcome needs to happen, right? Because a lot of times you've done it in a certain way and you expect someone else to do it the same way. The challenge is that everyone is unique, everyone has their own individuality. The more you do that, the more I started to realize that people leave, the teams lose their individuality in the process. They lose their autonomy. They lose their ability to get the job done. So the more you step in, the more they'll want you to step in, and it's a vicious cycle. So at some level, you just need to sort of step back and say, okay, look, you do the way you want, as long as I'm getting the outputs that work for us, right? And that's, I think, the biggest mindset shift I would say that has to happen. The second thing that I was like, you have to really be personally excited about people management, right? You have to be excited about coaching people, working with them, working through, like, sharing things with them, spending time with them in these conversations. And so it's a journey that you have to go through them. So like constant feedback, constant coaching. That was sort of the second thing I needed, like, and because your management style can really have a big influence on their happiness or unhappiness at work and at home, actually. One of the quotes that I always heard when I was transitioning to the manager was like, remember how you were talking about your manager with your wife at home? Now you are that dinner table conversation, right, for someone else. And it's like, that was really a powerful way to think about this, right? Like you don't want to be a dinner table conversation, at least not in a bad way, for someone else, right? So at the end of the day, we're not doing, we're not, I mean, not everyone is trying to do cancer research here, right? So like, we can probably take it easy sometimes.
It's a very interesting thing that we teach at the Harappa School of Leadership in as the AMP program. The leadership track for us runs through the entire duration of the program. And some of the things that you talked about, communication, problem solving, being able to synthesize, are these skills that you can develop as you go along, as you learn about them? Do you feel that this is what differentiates one person with the same degree, with, as opposed to another person with a similar sort of background? The fact that they're able to problem solve, communicate better, the fact that they do critical thinking, and is that part of a leadership journey?
So I think, I think it's a big part of it. So for sure, problem solving, communication, sort of these softer skills become very, very important. Actually, more so as, like, even as a functional employee, like as you move on, like when you're a marketing manager, you're not necessarily doing the marketing, you're actually managing it. So the softer skills actually even become even more important, I think, as you grow up the organization. But I do think it can be cultivated, and I've seen that happen with myself. Like, I didn't join consulting. In fact, the other anecdote, like I said, like I did not actually make it through the consulting interviews, or did not get to the job when I was still a undergrad or at the Young India Fellowship, right? So, and I think I'd worked through a couple of years, honed myself, and then when I applied, I got through. And even then I go through a learning journey in the next 4 or 5 years to now being at a place where I'm very comfortable with sort of coming into a new situation, problem solving and communicating. So I've definitely personally gone through that journey where I think it's definitely possible for you to do it. I think the only thing I would say is that you need to keep at it, because what problem solving as an employee is very different from problem solving as a manager and as a leader, because there's so much around the synthesis. There's so much about being creative about it, not just be linear about problem solving, that starts to show up in your effectiveness. That you keep at it and you get there. I think I would just say, like, it is a lot about practice and keeping at it.
I'll quickly take this question that's come. We don't have the name here, but somebody is talking about leadership, technology leadership. How do you learn technology and then plan to go to market for business? I'm presuming that the question is really more about how do you use or how do you, in this today's day and age where technology is such an important part, what is it that the leader must do to sort of make sure that they're using technology in a way that it's helping them and their team?
I mean, I think the best advice I've got in my life is like, if you don't know, hire, right? So I mean, I think at some level, knowing that you will never know everything about a job to the right level of detail is a really liberating feeling, if you will, right? Like, so that I don't need to know the details of technology if I'm not generally an engineer myself, but as long as then I can work with someone who can help me with that. So I don't know if that sort of answers that question, but like, I think what, as a leader, then if you recognize that technology is integral to outputs or to productivity in your space, or even to sort of have a stronger go-to market, and you need to sort of make sure that who else is doing that, go and talk to those have those conversations, and again, really like without necessarily getting lost into the technology itself, but how it helps in your business. Having that view is on you as a leader, but then everything else is making sure that the person is empowered to deliver, you're making the right investments, etc. That's then becomes your job. Then someone else executes on bringing the technology into the business with their technical skill sets. If that, I don't know if that's the question, but I think I thought that was it.
There's another question. How do we handle or groom managers who may not appear to be empathetic to their managers? I think there's a question on chat here. So I think this is more from a point of view of how do you do upward management while you may still want to navigate the workplace better.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are genuine cases of people not being empathetic, and if that's the case, like there's very little that you can do to solve the situation. But actually, I have noticed that in 70-80% of the cases where people have that feeling that their leaders are not empathetic, is actually a problem of a broken relationship more than anything else between a manager and their supervisor or their leaders, right? And I think there's a lot of things you can do to improve that relationship going forward, which is sort of like having very honest and frequent conversations to understand what are the expectations. Are you sort of, how do you, and taking a view of like, how do you help their life? I think every time, like I've learned that, you need to, like, for move to the next level, you need to think about how do I make the life of my manager, my leader better? And like, once you start of course, within boundaries of reason and so on, right? And then once you take that view and have that conversation, it is very empowering for your leader to then sort of give you feedback, give you that sort of suggestions, work with you even to help you cross that boundary. So that would be my only thing, that of course, like, invest in that relationship. Don't assume the worst in your leaders. Try to sort of find ways in which you can connect, and you don't have to really do a lot. You just need to sort of make sure that your vision aligned, their vision, like they are all sort of going towards the same goals, and like you're here to help, and you're here trying to help, and you be open to hear feedback and suggestions from them. I think that really goes a long way. And people who've done that to me, like I've also been able to sort of repair those relationships, and as well as vice versa when it happened with me, and I've had to do the same to my seniors.
I'm going to take this question from I think someone who's joined us from South Africa, but I'm going to add a little here. Sure. I don't know if it's a he or a she, but the question is, how do you manage the issue of politics amongst your staff members? Ankur, I want you to answer that as a manager and as a leader. Is there a difference?
Yeah. I mean, the context of the politics makes a difference, I guess, but like, at least as a manager, I think you're sort of the cushion between the senior management and sort of the individual contributors, right? And so you're sort of like, I think there's a question of like whether you're fanning that politics in the first place a little bit. Like you should just step back and think about it. Like, are you sort of actually perpetuate without knowing it, but like perpetuating that politics a little bit by sort of taking stance about who do you like, who you don't like, sort of not having a filter when you're talking to others, or sort of trying to project yourself as the more senior person with someone else, like take credit. You're probably doing a lot of the things yourself a lot of times where that's driving that politics. Or if you know someone else is doing it, and I think the best thing you can do is probably ignore that noise around it, but just make sure that sort of you're delivering on the outcomes. Like the more you participate in the gossip, the politics, the worse you make for yourself. And it, like, there is a place and a requirement to vent out your frustrations for sure, but a lot of times it's not with your direct teams. A lot of times you want to do it with a friend outside, or you want to do it in a safe environment as opposed to within your teams, because that actually fans a lot of that political discussion. At least that's how I found it. And as a leader, I think the best thing that you can do is actually you step in. Sometimes you just need to sort of be a bit of a hardball and say, look, guys, like, this is not the culture I want for this team, right? Like, this is not how we should operate as a team. And like try to actually be directive sometimes, and sometimes be a little bit more collaborative, and actually setting a culture which is about positivity, which is about focusing on what's good for the company, and sort of figuring out what's right. And sometimes, look, you might want to address the root cause of the problem and why this is happening, but it is as important to sort of address the culture as a leader, and there's no alternative than sometimes to be strong about it and sort of be directive there.
Tanvi, you want to take some questions in the Q&A?
Yes, thank you, Seema. So there's an interesting question, a more personal question, that how has the Young India Fellowship helped you help build the leader in you?
Yeah, I think I've thought a lot about this, because you keep getting asked this question, and like, especially after 10 years now, as to like, how did it help change my trajectory? And I think the answer that I think makes more sense to me is that it helped me sort of move into a different orbit. So like, I think as someone who's sort of graduating from an engineering college, IIT Bombay, like I was the average of a good college. So I was probably decent. I would have gone into a job. I would have probably had a decent run at it. So I don't know how that trajectory would have been. But what the Young India Fellowship did is like inspired me to achieve a lot more. Like inspired me to sort of say that, okay, actually I can do more than I thought I could. And like the fact that, I've have a different baseline is not necessarily the reason where I need to stop here. So I think the growth mindset, what really super turbocharged, I think, in their fellowship for me. And if I pinpoint as to what is the reason why that happened, it was not the courses, it was not necessarily the fact that I was doing an ELM here and there. All of that contributed for sure. I think the most important thing was the energy that the class brought in together. It was the faculty, it was the discussions, the intellectual conversations, where you felt that that the world is so much more than I thought it could be. And I think with these programs, and I'm sure like with Harappa, like the energy is probably very similar. And I would encourage you guys to try to absorb as much of that, right? Like question, like, are you yourself in your way, in some sense, in your journey?
I think that's the famous P is equal to P minus I, which is performance is equal to potential minus interferences, and perhaps, of course, the growth mindset. I'm going to take a little minute here to talk about how a lot of what you sort of are talking about. I was interviewing someone who's a potential candidate for the AMP, and also a YIF alum, and was an engineer. And it's very interesting how your answers are echoing. And I think he was saying the same thing, that, I came from a good college, everything was fine. I thought I was going to do well. But what it did for me was open my mind to many things. I don't remember the courses that I was taught, but I remember feeling and learning and understanding some of the things that I wouldn't have understood otherwise. He talked about gender equality. He talked about, growth mindset, of course. And I think the AMP also, we have a cohort which has graduated, and we have a convocation happening 2 days down the line. And I think we're hoping that many of them will say that the program actually helped them. The leadership skills that we taught of problem solving, of communication, of collaboration are really coming from, and growth mindset, really come from the fact that you learn to understand that leadership is not about always leading others, but it's leading yourself. It's understanding what you can do for yourself first, and then sort of look at this outward. Okay, I think I'm going to quickly pick up a question, and Tanvi, maybe the next one you can take. This is an interesting question that's come from, I think it's Ravi. And Ravi says, just one second. How do you use practicing time management when you were a manager? And I will add again to say, how do you do it as a leader?
So I think there are two aspects to it. For me, it's energy management becomes a lot more important than time management, at least for myself personally, because like at the end of the day, like I know there are 24 hours to fill a day, but like if I have my energies, I could push a bit longer here. I could I sort of wear out much earlier in the day, and then you don't have that. So I think time or energy put together, I think for me, the main point is, again, goes back to saying, okay, where is your investment the most value for yourself and for the company, right? So which part of your team, which part of the problem that you need to focus on more to deliver the outputs that you need to deliver, and then sort of be ruthless about working on those things and sort of stepping back and doing that, right? And I think there's some simple tools and hacks that I've learned to develop for myself that I use, right? So for example, I always, like, at the beginning of a quarter, a month, like I have a general plan of, okay, like this is where I want to land. I do some self check-ins with myself. So I lock my calendars, the dates, to say, okay, like, on 15th of the month, etc. Like how far am I on the track? Every week I have like a 2-hour block on a couple of days that are just for myself to not get distracted from others. Because if I don't step back, if I don't reflect on what am I spending my time on, like it's very easy to get sort of going with the flow, and then sort of you just step back and you realize you've not done it. So like having these blocks of time, and it could be any way, right? If you're a morning person, using the morning hours, when you're going for a walk. If you're someone who likes your evenings, then that could be a time. Like if you're whatever works for you, but like make sure you have some time allocated for yourself, which is a no meeting zone, that you're able to step back, think about it, and have milestones, have check-ins to calibrate where you want to spend your time in it. And this is all sort of within yourself, but then also make sure you're spending some time with your managers and your employees, just to get feedback from them as to like how are they feeling about this, and how are, like, maybe you need to calibrate where you're stepping, either going too deep or too shallow with a particular topic. So I think a combination of these things help. Now, as you become, as you sort of grow from employee to manager, I think that and manager to leader, I think that the fundamental concept remains the same. The main difference that I have learned is the value of patience. Is sometimes you're like, at least I was very excited to get something done immediately, and like, if I don't do this now, maybe you will not get the growth the next month, and like, there's a sense of urgency that you're self-imposing on certain things. And a lot of times, like, with experience, actually, what, like, the cost of not doing something is actually not that high. And so like you will leave that a lot more easily going forward, right? So I think that's where the difference is. You are able to even better prioritize, because you develop judgments for where you can afford to let go and where you cannot. I think that's the main evolution I've seen for myself, at least.
We have an interesting question from Pinkle Singh. What suggestions would you give for a manager in a situation where their reporting manager is not taking responsibilities, and the manager is looking to cultivate the culture of being more dependable for the reporting manager?
Sorry, I'm not sure I follow the question. So is this basically saying that?
So it's basically saying that if you're a manager and you have a co-worker who's not really pulling the weight that they should. I mean, you want to delegate work to them, you want them to do their best, but they are not sort of delivering to the point that you want them to deliver, what do you do then?
Yeah, I think this is also evolved. I think I'll answer this as a manager and then how you do it as a leader, right? So I think as a manager, like my default was to be very open and direct with whoever that employees was. Like obviously give them chance, like, you start the conversation by saying, okay, let us work together on where the roadblocks are. You try to fix those roadblocks along the way. You spend some time working with them. You show, don't tell, but you do co-working sessions as opposed to just a meeting. So hopefully the person picks up. If it's an attitude issue, you give them direct feedback to say, okay, look, my expectation from someone at this level is to do this, or the organization expectation is to do this. And then I know that you are sort of, your aspiration is to sort of grow into the managerial candidate next time. I think from that perspective, I really think that this is an area that you need to sort of cover gaps on, and like till you are sort of hitting this, So like being open and directive, but not sort of in a bad way. I'm just saying, like, being honest to that person is generally very helpful. And when you do that, you go in with an empathy of saying you will willing to help them cross the bridge and not just leave them hanging there, right? So that's what I've done. Like, and I think as a leader, what I've started to also realize is that people come with different skill sets and different abilities. So if I'm like, the first question I start to ask is, am I asking this person to stretch way beyond what they can, right? Like, am I going to waste my time actually and waste their energy in trying to sort of bridge a gap that cannot be bridged this way, right? So maybe a person is a much stronger communicator, but not necessarily a great problem solver. Then there is a limit to what I can expect that person to sort of deliver on problem solving. And yes, I should push that, but like sometimes I just want to manage my expectation and sort of refocus that person towards something else, and so on and so. So you sort of try to mitigate that a bit more structurally by reallocating work, as opposed to sort of match the personalities, as opposed to necessarily trying to push a person to grow and so on and so forth, right? It's interesting, like once you've done this a few times, you start to recognize who can deliver and who cannot, and like you already start to sort of have a much stronger impulse for it, and so that's where the value you bring in to your manager, giving them that guidance as well, and so on and so forth, right? So that they can work with the colleagues.
Thank you, Ankur. I have a follow-up question, which is on similar lines. How do you develop proactiveness amongst team members? Can a leader do it through his own or her own examples? And if yes, how?
So I think as an employee, you're sort of, a lot of times I see, like especially early on, you're in that mind space of, oh, if something is needed of me, someone will reach out to me and ask me for it, right? Like, so they actually wait to be pulled into a conversation. They'll sit back and get their work done or not get done, and they'll wait for a manager to ask them that question to say, is it done or not done, to set up those reviews and so on and so forth. I think the transition that you want to have is to shift that. The proactivity is what you want them to sort of say, okay, look, here's a timeline, here's when I'll do it, and if I don't do it, I will let you know early in advance. I will sort of ask for help early on, and so on and so forth, right? So what I've seen usually being effective is, first of all, laying that expectation out clearly, that when you're discussing an assignment, to say, okay, look, this is my expectation, is that if you need something, help or support, that you will sort of ask me out, right? I'm not going to chase and sort of ask for updates and so on and so forth, right? So setting that expectation a bit clearly, first of all. The second is also not trusting them in the first already, right? Like you have to assume that they won't. And so you set up regular check-ins at certain points in time. And then in each of these conversations, you need to keep reinforcing that message, right? So you don't go in and start the meeting by asking about what's happening. You go in and you stay quiet, you let them sort of talk about it, right? When they start fumbling once or twice, the third time they will know that, they need to come prepared to this conversation a little bit more. And the fourth time you expect them to sort of send something in advance. And like, so you build that muscle, you set that expectation over time. And I think that really helps in sort of having that culture where an employee is more proactive. And like, of course, like along the way, you give them that feedback that you need to.
I'm going to pick this question, Ankur. I wanted to ask, this is, I think, Manjusha. She wants to know, how can inclusion and equity in the working scenario, be it management, IT, or any other company, how does that really work? Earlier, it was said that the survival of the fittest is the way, but nowadays, is it the survival of the smartest that's most important? I think smartest and fittest for me is the same thing, but I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah, I'm assuming, I don't know if you mean, Manjusha, here that, when you're sort of smartest, you're sort of playing the sensitivities of inclusion and equality. If that's kind of what you're trying to say. Look, I think at the heart, most organizations, and again, look, this is an evolving complex topic, so I can't really assume that I have any expertise on this topic, to be completely honest. So whatever I'm saying is based on my personal experience. But like most organizations, want to do the right thing, and the right thing changes in the nuance of the culture, right? So like now that there is so much more awareness around diversity, inclusion, equality, right? Like a lot of the organizations want to make that special effort, at least the good ones, to sort of make sure that that is translated into how we do things, right? So, and sometimes that requires that extra effort on employees and so on, to remember that and keep doing that. So as a leader, you reinforce that message, where you basically say that, look, like you're sort of championing that yourself, and then when you see a leader champion, like people follow, right? So that's one thing that I have seen. But I don't, at least I've not been in any organization where you're gonna get a promotion because you are showing more sensitivity towards someone. The reverse is definitely true. Like you're insensitive, you might sort of face a nuance, right? I think the baseline becomes you have to be sensitive. So I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, maybe there's a follow-up I can clarify.
Ankur, interestingly, I just wanted to understand from you, there's an equation that Pramath talks about all the time, which says, really, in today's day and age, leadership is really about managing performance. It's about managing people, and it's about managing self. Or rather, it's about leading performance, doing very well at what your organization expects you to do, leading people, and leading yourself. Any thoughts on that?
It's a very interesting way to put this, because I've never thought about this, but it's very true. Because I think if you're not managing yourself, leading yourself, what ends up happening is your energy turns to, like, you stress out, and once you stress out and you don't manage that proactively, you're sort of letting everyone else know you're stressed out. Like there's no way, if you're spending like 10-12 hours together every day, you don't recognize when someone else is in stress, right? Like it's very evident. So I think as a leader, you set the tone for it. So 100% that piece, but also sort of staying ahead of the curve, learning the trends, so that you are you're able to give meaningful direction to everyone else. Like all of that is quite important, because I think I actually remember a conversation with Pramath when I was discussing this, like this transition to leadership. And I think one of the unlocks for me also was like the biggest roadblock was start acting like a leader, right? Which basically means start being directive to others, right? And I keep saying directive. I've said this a few times. I just want to make sure it's not landing as authoritative. I think directive is different than authoritative. Directive is like making sure you give them guidance. But to give guidance, you need to be able to yourself have an idea. So I think that is the self part for me. And obviously, like performance, I think is a no-brainer. And I think I also talked about the people bit. So if you're not a people champion, I don't think the organization is going to give you a lot more people to manage. I think most organizations have 360 feedback cultures. They have a necessary almost, it's all like a lot of them actually have us as a performance manager. Like your performance evaluation is also based on how well you are as a manager. So 100%, I think it's quite important. But even if you strip that aside, if you're not good with your teams, it starts to show up in 3 months. The performance of the team starts to deteriorate. They don't follow you. So I think it's a very good trifecta of putting it here.
I have a follow-up question, Seema. And, since we spoke about performance, and this is an appraisal season for a lot of organizations and employees, right? Do you have any tips for people who are in independent contributor roles, people who are managers, and people who are leaders? I would love to understand about what perspective runs across different levels, and how can one focus on goal setting for the coming year? I know these are 2-3 questions attached.
No, I'm just if I'm being very honest, I think in most organizations, goal setting is a very broken process, right? And sort of and that sort of creates a lot of anxiety amongst people, because what happens is when you set a goal, but then there's so many things that are outside your control, that leads you to not being able to deliver on them, and then people get affected. So I think what I've seen generally helpful is make sure you're sort of calibrated on the principle of the goals, in addition to your the specifics of it with sort of your managers, and then you're checking in with enough frequency to know that you're aligned on the principle and you're aligned on the direction, even if the numbers themselves don't show, or even if that sort of metric is being hit. Because I think in general, that's probably like everyone understands that externalities happen and goals don't get met. But if you're not checking in early, maybe there's something you could have done differently that you didn't. And then sort of you have surprises at the end of the cycle. So I think, check in always, like have a clear expectation conversation, check in advance and continuously, so that it's almost a non-topic of conversation when the actual appraisal happens, because you almost expect the output of it beforehand, before you actually go into the review process, right? That's the best place you can be actually at. Like you and your manager are fully aligned on what the outcome will be, and the outcome is more a system formalization of that conversation that has happened a few times with you. I think that's the only advice I would give, that don't ever be don't ever be sort of away from a manager on that respect. I think as a leader, the conversation shift a little bit from month to month and quarter to quarter goals, and the principle, like, to a little bit more longer term conversations. And you need to show a little bit of that mindset yourself as you're growing in the organization. But in a sense, again, like, the conversation shift to 5-year journeys. And then how does my next year needs to look to achieve that 5-year vision a little bit more than, what I need to do in the next 6 months. I think other than that, the principle remains very much similar across both the levels. Seema, you're on mute.
Sorry, there's a question here from someone who wants to ask, again, I don't have a name here, but they want to understand, how do you experience failure in management or as a leader, and the challenges you saw in the pre and the post sort of COVID era? I mean, were there any specific challenges that one experienced as a leader, and now suddenly those challenges are completely different? How do you deal with that?
I think the biggest difference has been in the distributed team setup, I would say, right? Like, so like, while in a lot of ways that has a lot of benefits for the employees, I found that, it's very difficult to work with a colleague a lot more closely if you're sort of distributed. So like Zoom calls have a certain limitation in being able to be empathetic towards someone else, like sit down, do working sessions, there's no drawing book. So the technology doesn't catch up as much, right? So I'm actually like, I'm okay with hybrid working spaces, etc., but I'm generally hard to work remotely. And I actually have right now colleagues that are sitting away, like someone in Lebanon I'm managing in Dubai, and it becomes hard sometimes to have those conversations. This has amplified a lot more, I think, after COVID, for sure. And I think that's a failure of leadership, is that if that person sitting some other remote part of the world feels disconnected from everything else that's happening in the business, that's kind of recipe for poor performance and, like, disengagement in general. So that's one thing that I would say has changed. But other than that, I think I don't know, like, business realities have shifted. Of obviously things that were working before are not. Customers have changed their way of thinking. So you being able to be current on the trend has become a lot more important, because it's a lot more dynamic today than it was, I think, a couple of years back.
We want to take the other questions. So there's a question from Maulik, and then there's one from Gagan.
Yes. So there's a question here. How do you shift from working under a small company, then taking corporate individual KRA and execution under a large scale organization?
I mean, I made some transitions myself. not necessarily from small to big, but like differently structured organizations. I think if your intrinsics around some of the things that Seema, you were referring to, around problem solving, communication, around having empathy with people, this trifecta of managing yourself, performance and your teams. If you have those intrinsics in place, the transition is generally not that difficult. It takes you a bit of time to figure out the operating model in a new setup, like who's doing what do you get, how does the work get done. So I moved from a very in-person culture to a very Slack-driven culture when I transitioned from McKinsey to Careem. So a lot of work gets done on Slack. And like it took me a while to get used to it. It took me a while to understand like how and where does work get happen in a tech environment and versus a consulting environment. But it was a 3-month transition. And then I think afterwards I was completely fine. And I've done enough of these to know that you can always anchor on your core skills to do this. I think one thing that just may be helpful for someone to think about this transition, if you're making a decision, is I try not to change too many things about the transition. So I think generally people say that job industry, and let's say geography or something like that, right? Like, so if you're changing too many things at one time, you're generally bound to fail a little bit more. So try to keep 1 or 2 things common and then sort of transition on the third one potentially. So that helps.
Another question by Gagan. Developing second line of leadership is being talked about these days in organizations. How do you identify and prepare those managers as a future leader?
Yeah, this is a tough one, I think, especially because the time people are spending in any organization is becoming shorter and shorter. Right? Like I myself haven't haven't spent enough time in one organization to where I could sort of first grow and then grow someone else to sort of replace me and so on and so forth, right? But I think what I've seen work is and in these worlds where people start to overemphasize on generalist as a skill set, because what happens is sometimes you have enough of a generalist in the organization that can come in and take your place. And so you make sure that, you're grooming all of the generalist sort of leadership cadre in an organization in a certain manner, where the values that you want them to embody are actually well understood. So the culture is very well understood. The ways of working is very well understood. So even if they don't know specifically that business or that skill set, you're wired in a similar manner that someone else can come and replace you later. So I think that then becomes a formula that I've seen replicated, even like in places like Amazon, even in Careem, in McKinsey. Like all of these are very strong generalist training organizations with a very strong culture that everyone is able to at least deliver on a few different things in the similar manner. And so they become quite, so it's less about making sure that, everyone has a direct line of second leadership, but there's enough of a second line of leadership that can be used in plug and play modes in different parts of the organization.
Okay, I'm going to take this question. They want to know if there is a different approach to managing people with different personality types and different skill sets, especially in the creative field.
100%. I think that's sort of goes at the heart of people management, is that you cannot have a one way to manage with everyone. So you need to be able to look at the end of the day. I think managing people is nothing more than being empathetic towards the other person and sort of at the same time making sure that the organization objectives are being met. So actually, like bringing people along has to be about building real connections with them and being very honest about what the expectations are. So as with any person, your way of building connection changes based on their personality and their likes is like you have to sort of flex as a leader a little bit more. And sometimes you have to be also okay with knowing that you won't be the best friends with everyone. Like you will be more effective as a manager for a certain type of person, but you know that you will be a little bit less effective in a certain type of personalities. But at the same time, like, you can pull in, let's say in this situation, maybe you can pull in your manager and then sort of have them support you a little bit more in some conversations, or sort of you don't always have to be you solving all the problems as a manager, I think. So That's my only advice.
Ankur, I'm going to just follow that up with and just ask you. I understand that the manager doesn't have to be best friends with everybody. What about a leader? Does he or she have to be best friends with everyone?
I think practically no. I mean, I would love that if that was the case. But I don't think that ends up happening. What you do want to be is like respected and followed and sort of this thing. But I think you start to develop a much thicker skin, knowing that people will know your flaws. And I think you just start embracing those flaws a little bit more. So that's the aspiration, that you're able to sort of be a lot more friendly with everyone, and you're able to sort of have personal rapport with everyone. But yeah, I think the onus you're right, the onus is higher on the leader to actually do it, but then it's not always possible, I think. And I think you just as long as you have a working relationship that works and someone else is there to coach the employee, it generally works out, I think.
I have one last question. In a leadership role, what do you do when you have a senior manager exhibiting toxic behavior and your seniors are not taking it seriously?
Yeah, with a lot of these questions, the context really matters in sort of how you probably deal with this and the sensitivities of the situation around it. Again, the first question would be like, do you really believe that there is a toxicity, or is it a broken relationship? Like, that's something that you should test out for yourself. Maybe just have some conversations with peers where you can, who you trust, obviously, where you can have those conversations and test like what's their read on the situation or not. But if like, and maybe try to have some conversations without necessarily sort of don't put the other person in the spotlight, but just maybe talk about, look, when you did X in this situation, this is how it made me feel, and I did not know how to respond in this situation, and I didn't know what to do about it. So I just wanted to come and talk to you about it and see if we can handle something like this differently, or what could have I done differently so that the situation would have been like. So if you remove the personality out and sort of make it a little bit more about, okay, look, we are here to work together. Like, in this context, I felt this and I didn't know what to do. And like, how do we get to a place where next time this doesn't happen? A lot of times these issues get resolved if you're able to do it. Like, so one tip is, don't have this conversation when you're emotionally charged. Because you end up saying things and that make the situation worse. Think about it, reflect it, like try to sort of even frame this in a very dispassionate manner. But be authentic, not to say not be authentic, but sort of have a very calm conversation, composed conversation. And sometimes these things resolve. And if they don't, and if you're in actually a situation where you are a bad manager, then you have to sometimes gamble and sort of go to their supervisors and have a chat as to say, look, I'm in this position and I don't know how to deal with this. And in that case, there is both sides of outcomes possible, right? Like, there is that outcome possible where you're sort of seen as sort of a snitch or whatever, or like someone who's not necessarily like who's throwing the manager under the bus, or actually the supervisor has the wisdom and the maturity to handle this conversation differently. But in any conversation, try not to make it personal, try not to be about this person or about that person. Try to make it about the situation and how you are not being effective in that setup and how you want help to be more effective. I think that's the key.
We're almost at time. In fact, we're a little over time, but this last question, I can't resist, Ankur. And I think it's interesting. The person wants to know, can introverts ever become leaders?
Oh, I'm an introvert. So I know it doesn't probably, like, in this hour, I'm the one talking a lot, but generally I'm generally an introverted person. But like, I think with every skill, you learn to know when you need to sort of step out of your comfort zone, and you start to do that a lot more as you grow, right? So, there's that MBTI types, like not just from an introversion perspective, but also from emotional feeling versus thinking, also from, I'm forgetting all the different dimensions, but like from all your personality dimensions, there will always be things that you need to do outside your comfort zone. You do that when you need to, and then you find your peace when you can, and sort of recharge yourself. So I don't really feel introvert. In fact, introverts are usually a lot more visionary, is generally the feeling. So that you could capitalize on that in your leadership journey a lot more sometimes.
Tanvi, will you give us the vote of thanks?
Sure, sure. Thank you, Seema. Thank you so much, Ankur, for joining us today and sharing with us, some really insightful tips on how we can look at transition at different levels, at a manager, at a leader level. And, we hope the audience really enjoyed the session. We have some word of thanks for you in the chat as well throughout the session. And we would love to, have you come on board and share more tips in the future. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. And hopefully the audience found some value in this as well.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.